Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining. My name is David Vose. I'm Vice President of Risk Management at Archer. And today I want to talk about the concepts of risk appetite and risk tolerance and what they mean and how we can use them. So if we go to the undeniable source of all information, Facebook, you will often see memes like this: be reckless enough to gamble all or nothing to follow your dreams. Well, not really. We should be at least a little bit cautious, and we should know which risk we're taking and what gambles we're really making. After all, we're not all Tom Cruise, and my hat off to Tom Cruise. This man certainly risks everything in the pursuit of his art. Fantastic films. So what do the words mean to non-risk people? Well, appetite, if you go look it up in the dictionary, appetite is a desire or need for something, especially food. That makes sense. We all understand appetite. And appetite sort of implies that there's good stuff to be had there. And tolerance, well, tolerance doesn't really suggest that there's good stuff. Tolerance is the ability to bear something unpleasant or annoying, or to keep going despite difficulties. And it's actually a second meaning of tolerance, more in the engineering world, an allowable amount of variation of a specific quantity. So, for example, if you've got a machine, there'll be a tolerance to some microns of variation that's allowed on, say, the diameter of a piston. All right, so we've got the human understanding or the individual understanding what appetite and tolerance mean. So what does risk appetite and risk tolerance mean? Well, let's go to some authoritative sources. Well, according to ISO, you can see there, this is the ISO Guide 73/2009 in English. Appetite is the amount and type of risk that an organization is willing to pursue or retain. And for them, tolerance is the readiness to bear the risk in order to achieve objectives. And that sounds to me like really just the difference between willing and readiness. And I'm not really sure what the difference there is. And I feel I'm not alone here. Now, on the other hand, COSO, in their paper, Strengthening Enterprise Risk Management for Strategic Advantage, well, they went and said appetite is the amount of risk that an organization is willing to accept in pursuit of stakeholder value. Well, hang on. Isn't that the same thing as what ISO calls tolerance? And so what do they call tolerance? Well, they call tolerance an acceptable levels of variation an entity is willing to accept around specific objectives. And to be honest, that's a mouthful. I don't really understand it. So let's go to an example. All right, for example, quoting their article there, an entity that has set a target of a customer satisfaction rating of 90% may tolerate a range of outcomes between 88 and 95%. Well, hang on. Why would they tolerate something more than what they're aiming for? So they're aiming for 90%, but they'll tolerate up to 95%. I mean, wouldn't you want to tolerate, in inverted commas, 100%? I certainly would. To my mind, this idea of bracketing up and down around something doesn't really make sense for tolerate. And well, look what they've done. They've gone and used this interpretation of tolerance from the building code or engineering idea, that rather specific version of what tolerance means, and certainly not in the common vernacular. There are other contributors to this. If you go to, for example, Google and start searching for risk appetite versus risk tolerance, and maybe take a look at a few of the images that come up. I picked up a couple. So on the top here, you've got risk tolerance is apparently to left and right of some central value. So we got a bracket around that, and that plus or minus that risk tolerance is an acceptable risk. And if you add treatment in there, then it becomes risk appetite, and we've got risk thresholds, and risk capacity is, I don't really understand this, but I mean, we've got green, orange, and red, and I'm sure that this is all related to those heat maps that, if you've seen anything I've written about before, I'm not so keen on. Now, another example would be risk appetite, risks exposure we accept, and then to write risk exposure we can't accept. And it goes appetite, tolerance, capacity. Whereas here, tolerance is the smaller and appetite is the bigger, and then capacity is the largest of them all. In other words, we don't seem to have any consistent understanding of these terms. So I did a little exercise. I went on LinkedIn this week and I asked a little poll, which of these concepts refers to the amount of risk an organization can support in pursuit of its objectives? I just wanted to know, which one of these four statements would you say was going to be equivalent to that particular, or these concepts equivalent to that particular concept? Well, I did the survey. I've got 301 votes. I think it's up to 320. Feel free to go and add your contribution. And you can see risk appetite, 48%. Okay, and that sort of makes sense to me. But 22% said it was risk tolerance and 27% said it was risk capacity. And that really tells me that we just don't know what we're talking about. So this is no good. We need consistent definitions, hopefully ones that we can end up using in decision-making, so risk-based decision-making. That would be the ultimate goal. So I have a proposal. Appetite. Now, appetite to me is how much risk that you're willing to take when you balance it against the expected reward. So, for example, I've got two investments here, and this is showing probability distribution of how much profit one might make. Now, the blue one is further to the right. It's got a smaller probability of being negative than the red one. And it has a larger probability of being a bigger number. So we can sort of put that together and you can see the probability of negative, some loss. We've got a small amount of loss for the blue with a small probability, that's probability on a vertical scale, and a big probability of a large gain, certainly when you compare it with the other investment. Now that would say to me that I would want to go for the blue investment. It's a good one. And perhaps the red investment or the orange investment is not such a good one. Okay, so that would be a good idea. You're trying to take your appetite as the balance of how much you might make versus how much you might lose. So it's a gamble. Tolerance, on the other hand, is how much you will accept of experiencing the possibility of very large levels of damage. So it's kind of like looking at the tail end of bad. What's the worst that we're willing to accept as either as a business or as an individual? All right, if you bear with me and accept these ideas, let's move on. So appetite is about balancing risk and reward. So for example, we might have an investment. We should be willing to invest $20 million in this project. It's got a 20% chance of being a total loss. We lose a 20 million, but it's got an 80% chance of a profit of 100 million. So that's a 20-to-1 ratio. If you go 20% times minus 20 versus 80% times 100, you can see it's a 20-to-1 ratio. And maybe we have a sort of a rough rule of thumb that says if you get a 5-to-1 ratio, that's a good thing. So we would say, let's go for it. But tolerance is about not stretching yourself too far. So, we've got that possibility of losing that 20 million. Can we really afford to do so? Well, the response might be, normally, that would be a great investment. We go ahead, but we're already taking a lot of risk elsewhere. And if you put it all together in the portfolio of risk, so in the aggregate, this would increase our chances of going bust, so go into liquidation, to up to 5%, which is way higher than the agreed threshold of 1%. Maybe we'll accept a 1% chance, but 5%, that's just too much. Now, this seems to me like a system in which that we can use, where we can start saying we can make actual decisions based on them. Your own personal risk management. Let me pose you a problem. If heads, you win $10, tails, you lose $1. Who wouldn't go for that? I certainly would. There are people who wouldn't, by the way, but I would certainly go for it. So yeah, 10-to-1 return. Excellent, let's do it. And heads, you win $1 million. Fantastic. But tails, you lose $100,000. Now, for most people, they don't really have $100,000 cash to spare. And so they would not take that. No, thank you very much. Even though the return to the risk is still 10 to 1. It's not within the capacity you have. It's not within your tolerance to accept a loss of $100,000. Okay. Now, we're not all Elon Musk. Most of us have some level of risk aversion. In fact, just as I'm recording this, Falcon 9 is launching. My fingers are crossed for him. I do hope it works out. You might recall that both SpaceX and Tesla were absolutely on the verge of going bust. So Elon Musk had a mission. SpaceX's fourth flight for Falcon 1 had to be a success or he would have run out of money. So on his very last attempt, he threw every last bit of cash of SpaceX in there. Fingers crossed, let's hope it works out. And it did. And he got a phone call afterwards. Well done. Here's a $1.8 billion contract from NASA. So it all worked out for him. But he's the sort of person who would, according to that Facebook meme, risk everything to achieve your dreams. Well, good for him, but that really isn't how most businesses work. Right, let's look at the application to risk management. So market, credit, strategic risk. These are areas where we're trying to invest in something. We're creating a new product. We're merging. We're purchasing a business, et cetera, Risk appetite makes sense. We need to dare. We need to take chances if we're going to achieve our objectives. If you take no chances, you will simply stagnate and eventually die. So you need to do that balancing. And in market, credit, strategic risk, this makes sense to have risk appetite. And also it makes sense to have your risk tolerance. You want to keep a tally on the total, the aggregate amount of exposure so that you don't push it too far. But operational risks are a bit different. In operational risks, these are things that just basically go wrong, and it's not balancing against some benefit. It's just stuff happens. Well, risk appetite, there is no risk return trade-off. So this does not apply. You cannot use risk appetite for operational risks. But you certainly can use risk tolerance. And operational risks, they add to the tail of your risk exposure. They push out the possibility of you losing greater and greater money, especially if you're looking at things like big compliance fines or cybersecurity risks. So you need to include that in the aggregate exposure that the business faces. Well, you will often see things like this, where you've got green, yellow, amber, and red. You've got people define risk appetite as a threshold. Anything inside the green, that's within our appetite. Anything inside yellow is within our tolerance. Anything inside orange is within our capacity, etc. And you can create this sort of heat map where you've got probability on one side and you've got impact on the other. But it just doesn't apply. So whenever you see these ideas here, I suggest that you challenge them. They don't really mean anything to me because they're to do with operational risk. They're not contributing to the idea of balance of benefit versus risk. Right, so risk appetite, I hope I've made my point really here, that I do not believe that risk appetite applies at all in the domain of operational risk. Tolerance and capacity, they do apply. So how can you define your risk tolerance level? Well, there are three basic steps to this. First step is to build out a structure of your entities. So you've got your parent company and you've got maybe child entities and sub-child entities all the way down. And the reason we do that is because if you have a big corporation, you might have a number of quite small businesses at the end of that food chain. And those small businesses will have quite a different appetite and quite a different tolerance than the big corporation as a whole. So in order to do it really well for the risk tolerance, we need to be able to tailor the risk tolerance levels to the individual business to reflect the capacity that they have to absorb risk. Then we want to look at, ideally, the different types of impact. Now, financial is an obvious one. We typically look at the potential for loss of money, but there are other types of impact that we should care about: environmental damage, reputation, safety, carbon footprint, human rights violations, etc. And if you're dealing with projects, you've already got the idea of maybe cost overruns, but delays as well. Some projects will happily be able to absorb and still be considered a success if they have, say, 5-10 days, and others 5 or 10 days is a complete disaster. And then once we've set up our list of the different types of impact that we care about, then we need to define scales. And the scales appropriate to the entity sometimes, and then scales which are ubiquitous. So those that are appropriate to the entity could be financial, carbon footprint, delays if it's a project. But then for those that are not quantifiable, then we still need to sort of define scales. Like what would we mean by an extremely large reputational impact, or a human health and food safety impact, or human rights violations? Some scales should be ubiquitous, meaning that you can't, as a smaller entity, you can't start setting a different scale than you do at the corporation, because they represent moral values. So environmental damage, if it's a small entity that has created some catastrophic environmental damage, that should not be valued any less than if it was if it happened to the owning corporate entity. And same thing for safety and human rights. So what we need to do on the left-hand side, this is Archer Insight. By the way, Archer Insight is GRC Enterprise Risk Management tool from Archer, my company. On the left-hand side, you see the entity structure, and then I've just highlighted here the catastrophic threshold, and we put it in for financial, health and safety. And for some things, we will have numbers, so like 25 billion would be catastrophic. 25 billion as a catastrophic risk, you could kind of equate that to something like the amount of money that would mean that we couldn't service our debt, and so therefore we would have to break out the company and sell off our assets, significant assets, in order to be able to continue to survive in some form. You also might have another one for health and safety. Death of several people would be your fault. Not to say that these are equivalent to the numerical catastrophic level, but we need to decide what we mean by catastrophic in health and safety, give some guiding statements. And the same thing for reputation, strategic, environmental damage, etc. One question we might ask ourselves is, what's the reasonable probability of catastrophe? And there's an interesting article I'll point you to over here. You can go look it up. And just taking a little quote out of that, a recent study by McKinsey found that the average lifespan of companies listed in the Standard & Poor's 500, the S&P 500, was 61 years in 1958, but today it's less than 18 years. So if we'd always like to think of, okay, 1 in a million, 1 in 100,000 or something, but that's not really realistic. This is essentially talking about a zero risk. You might consider something like around 1% chance per year to be a reasonable statement of what's a reasonable probability of acceptance for a catastrophic list. But I mean, it's up to you. But there are some sort of guiding ideas that you can look to. If your tolerance of, say, was catastrophic was 1% per year, then that surely means logically that you should accept a higher probability for lower impacts. So we first need to define what those lower impact levels are. So it turns out that if we think about it, that this idea of tolerance isn't really a single point, but maybe an entire line where we relate impact and how willing we are to accept a particular impact. So it's kind of an XY plot. So first define these lower impacts, and then you can see the chance of exceeding them. All right, so here we had that first level. And what happens if we then add some more? So maybe catastrophic was 25 billion for this Bradford Industries, and we move the next one down, extremely high, 8 billion, very high, 2.5 billion, etc. And we can also define other statements for those non-quantitative types of impact. What I've typically found is that if you have, say, 10 levels, having 5 orders of magnitude, or however many levels you have, 5 orders of magnitude between the catastrophic and the basically nil is pretty good. It works very well. That's for financial. Things would be different for other types of impact. All right. Now, if we do that, and if we look at all of the risk that we're exposed to, and we do some quantitative analysis. So one of the great advantages of quantitative analysis is that you can you can look at the aggregate risk, and we could start asking ourselves, how likely is it that we will exceed a particular level of financial loss? So, for example, here we've got the catastrophic loss. We've got 0% chance for these different entities, but we've got an extremely high loss. This entity here, Bradford Medical Devices, has got a 0.3% chance. Here we are, 0.3% chance that it's going to exceed that. And it has a 14% chance it's going to exceed this very high. So, and that's quite nice because it immediately tells us which of our entities are actually really exceeding their tolerance for risk. We can also look at the tolerance for individual risk. So if you, I've already said I don't really like heat maps, but this is a little bit different. Here we've got actual probabilities or frequencies, and we've got this extremely low to catastrophic level on the bottom. And because we can talk about different types of impact and the consequences they have, well, we can compare different types of risk. So here we've got reputation, we've got financial, strategic, health and safety. We can plot them all on the same plot. And this is basically comes down to mapping these things together using something called utility theory. This is built into Archer Insight as well automatically. So that's really nice because it can tell us where our biggest risks are, the ones that get progressively more towards the orange and the red, where actually anything in the same color does mean something. These are of equal expected utility value. So anyway, it tells us, do we have any individual risks that will at least eke into our tolerance for risk? But we can also look at the aggregation. Like, do we, in terms of like the total amount of financial exposure or health and safety or environmental damage, whatever, what chances do we have of exceeding these different levels or different thresholds? And you can see, for example, here we've got the highest amongst all of them is the financial. It's got the highest probability of reaching or exceeding the catastrophic level. This is not to say that these are directly comparable, but it does certainly say, well, look, we've actually got some very small, but we do have some level of probability that we're going to exceed the environmental damage catastrophic threshold. So this is quite nice. It tells us, are we managing our health and safety and our environmental thresholds, our tolerance for risk well? And it seems so in this case. We're doing it much better than, for example, the financial. And that's it. Thank you very much for your attention. I do hope you found this useful, and I hope to talk to you again in a future meeting. Bye-bye.